I'm Nat Wheelwright. I'm at Bowdoin College, and I have the pleasure of talking to Bette Loiselle, who is at the University of Florida. We're at the 50th anniversary meeting of ATBC in San Jose, and also celebrating the 50th birthday party for OTS. And it's a pleasure, Bette, to talk to you. And I'd like to begin by asking how in the world you got from being a small girl to a celebrity in tropical ecology. Where was the seed that got you first interested?
You know, Nat, it was totally serendipitous. I was at the University of Illinois doing my master's degree with Jim Carr, who was very famous tropical ornithologist who was working in Panama and working on the pipeline road in Panama. And this was 1980. Or actually 1979, and it was March, and it was 1 week before his next field trip to go down to the pipeline road. And I happened to be in the hall outside his office, and all of a sudden he looked panicked. He came out of his office, he looked at me, and he said, "What are you doing next week?" And I said, well, nothing, it's spring break. I was just gonna stay around here. And he says, "Will you come to Panama with me?" And his field assistant, who he'd been going to Panama with for years, had just eloped and gave him a call and said, "I can't go." And so, of course, I jumped at it, having no expectations, and all the other lab mates were furious because they'd been there for years and didn't have the opportunity. And I knew within, hours of landing in Panama, this was my first tropical experience, that this is what I wanted to do. This is where I wanted to work. And the actual other thing, so I went with him for his next 3 or 4 field trips, and it was on, I think, the 3rd field trip that all of a sudden this guy from Costa Rica was just visiting for a week, Tim Mormont, who ended up being my PhD advisor. And Tim showed up, and Jim and I were out catching birds all day, working with an Earthwatch group. Tim came in just incredibly enthusiastic. And then in the morning, we would go off netting birds, and Tim would go off on his own with a couple of black plastic bags, and he'd be gone all day, and then come back at the end of the day, and the bags would be full of stuff. And then he was like a kid. He'd open the bag, and he'd pull this out and say, "Look what this is," and then describe, something about the natural history of it. And it was at that moment I knew, I want to work with him. And so then I went back to Illinois and I prepared my PhD applications to a variety of places, but Wisconsin was my number one choice, and that led me to LaSalle Biological Station to do my dissertation work.
Wow. Now, my question actually was how you got to be a girl and then a tropical ecologist, and you suddenly jumped ahead to your master's. So if you had turned left instead of right and not bumped into Jim Carr in the hall, would you have ever ended up in the tropics? Did you have just long-time natural history leanings of
Well,
but
I
not
would say
birds?
I had, leanings towards nature, but I grew up in a family that thought going camping was going to the Holiday Inn on the way to Florida to see the grandparents. And so I didn't really, I think, have the opportunity to explore this interest that I had at that time. And I actually, for my undergraduate degree, was totally convinced that I was heading towards working in the State Department and working on sort of political economy, and in particular focusing on the Soviet Union. I took 4 years of Russian. I took, all courses related to political science and economy and things like that. And then I had to take the one, biology course that you sort of need to take when you're doing a general liberal arts degree, and realize that, oh my God, this exists and this is fun. And I just turned around at that point. So it was a really inspiring professor at the University of Chicago that just sort of opened my eyes about actually having a career in the biological sciences.
You never took a graduate OTS course, but you have led numerous ones and been resource person on many others. Take us through the history of teaching with OTS. What was your first experience? What made you decide to lead a course?
Well, I did my research at LaSalva Biological Station from, 1983 was the first time I went, and then I was there continuously from 1985 through much of 1986. So I saw a number of courses come through, and at that time it was very easy to interact with the courses and the professors and stuff because LaSalva was much smaller in terms of the research community and education and things going on, I love being in the field. I love the excitement of showing things to students in the field. And I finished my degree in 1987, and I guess I went right from finishing my degree in December to coordinating a course with Bill Alderson, who was a graduate student also at the University of Wisconsin, had finished about the same time. And so we taught the winter course in 1988, and then I guess I figured I've got to learn how to do it right, so I needed to do it again, and went and taught courses, I guess 4 more courses over the next few years, and I don't know, it's just an experience that's exhilarating and fun. Every day is new, and you have such opportunities to interact with the greatest minds in tropical biology, as well as the upcoming stars in tropical biology with the courses. It's a really fun, creative, stressful, tiring, but exhilarating kind of environment to be in an OTS course. Intense.
Over the years, have you seen changes in both the students that are participating in OTS courses and in the kinds of science that they do? Or what patterns have you seen?
It's the one, there's a couple things that's interesting. So I have done a lot of the sort of the fundamentals in tropical biology course with the gringos, so to speak, as well as the Ecología de Poblaciones course, which is the sort of the Spanish version of the course, and being resource person on that course. And one of the things that was really interesting about those 2 courses in some ways is that a lot of the gringos, so to speak, this was their first real true experience doing sort of ecology or biology in the tropics. And so there was a real big focus a lot on just the natural history and learning about interactions between plants and animals and who's there and how to tell things apart and stuff like that, and then get into sort of the questions and asking things. In many of the cases with the Latin American courses, a lot of these students had tremendous experiences already in tropical forest, and so they came in at sort of a different knowledge base of the system, and a lot of them had that sort of natural history background. So it sort of had a little bit shift in where you might focus the course, and so you did a lot more focus on sort of how you design and ask questions from the very beginning in the Latin Americans course, and doing some sort of development of statistical approaches and whatnot. So there was sort of that difference between the English and the Latin American courses that I noticed early on. But I think that in a lot of ways there's, a lot of the things are the same. The interest in discovery and, the failed projects that lead to even better projects. And that's where the excitement comes, because you learn something new and unexpected in the failure of an experiment that may put you off in a new direction. So I think that the kinds of equipment that we used in the first courses was very rudimentary, and you were very creative in setting things up, and that sort of gradually improved over the year, and all of a sudden you have GPS units and video cameras, and you can do sophisticated presentations. You don't need to use the white sheets of paper to draw things out. You can do a lot more with PowerPoint, but those kinds of changes have happened, and maybe not necessarily for the good. I think there's a lot to be said for hand drawing your graphs that makes you think about what you're putting down on paper a little bit more carefully when you put it up.
Sometimes it's fun when the power goes out, isn't it?
That's
it makes
right.
you go back. Is there anything you miss about the old days, or anything that you're pretty glad to see gone about the olden days? late 80s kinds of courses?
Oh, I don't think there's anything I would miss about the late 80s. Well, yes, there's one thing. In my first course, we had 22 students and we had 2 computers. And so and at that point, everybody's supposed to finish all the reports and everything and turn it in the end. And so that did get a little stressful. But then I did see, even when you had 6 computers, it was about just as stressful. But eventually it got to like a computer per student because they brought their own down. So at least the sort of the stress associated with trying to finish your projects with limited access to computers, I think was a good thing to have gone away. And so it only became the stress of finishing your project with your own computer that still remained, but at least you had no excuses at that point not to finish.
How have your experience in the tropics affected the way you've taught students when you were at University of Missouri at St. Louis and now at University of Florida?
I think it, totally influenced the way I became a professor and what I did as a professor. And this whole idea of the inquiry-based learning by doing, I mean, that's what you need to do. I mean, that's what's effective. That's what captures attention. And I think that even in my classes that were more lecture-driven sort of classes, it was always taught in a way that was, discussion format and opportunities for students themselves to add their experiences, what they know, to contribute essentially, so that you created this overall learning environment where it's not, one-way professor to the student, but it's everybody that's contributing their knowledge to kind of advance the topic that you're talking on. And it also led me to develop my own OTS style course at the University of Missouri St. Louis. So we were a program that had a lot of international students, and we had a big focus in tropical biology. And I knew that a lot of our students coming from Latin America were going to land in St. Louis, focus themselves to get their master's or their PhD, and not get out of St. Louis unless we gave them an opportunity. So I developed a field course that we would travel on weekends and go to a variety of different biomes that we can in the weekend, which included places as far away as the Great Smoky Mountains, the northern extension of the Chihuahuan Desert, the Kanza Prairie in Kansas, and things like that. And we taught the course in very much sort of an OTS fashion through the course, and it was fantastic.
Tell you a little bit more about what was the OTS fashion. Take us through a day in the Ozarks.
Yeah, a day in the Ozarks. So what we would plan it out ahead of time. We would almost always have a local resource person, whether it was a scientist that was at Kanza Prairie, a Park Service official that really knew the landscape, a student that might be actually working in the system. We took the student along. So we would have our orientation to the site, that after we landed, we'd set up camp, and then we would go out and get ourselves oriented. And we always did this sort of 50 questions type thing. So go out there, think about what you're seeing, and think about what kinds of, what interests you, what looks unusual, how would you compare this to other sites that you've been. And then we would have discussions in the evening where people would toss out, I found this really interesting, or I found that really interesting. And then depending on the site, we might do small group projects, or we might just focus it more on developing research questions and design. So then going out and maybe doing some preliminary work to kind of follow up on maybe one of those ideas that you had developed in your first visit and orientation to the site. And I got to tell you another story about that, though, because there are lots of bonding experiences. So we had this big 15-passenger van, and we had a little Toyota truck that carried all our gear, and the van carried most of the people. And we were gone sometimes from Thursday afternoon, coming back Sunday late at night, and everybody, they're got a bunch of classes, and most of them have classes in common. And again, there were a lot of international students, and at that time, our international students would tape the lectures of the professors. So I can't tell you how many trips that on the way back, we were listening to Al Gentry lecturing on biogeography, or Bob Marquis lecturing on community ecology, or something like that. So we all got to enjoy those experiences together on the way back. And I must admit, during one election year, Al Gentry sounded just like Ross Perot, but talking about biogeography.
He's got my vote. So you say a 50-passenger bus. Is it filled with 50 passengers?
15.
Oh, 15.
15
That sounds
passenger
better.
van.
Okay. Good. Well, I was going to say, you're a bold person, bolder than I. And so here you were based in St. Louis, now you're in Gainesville, and yet, despite those being urban areas, you have found ways to incorporate into your teaching the OTS model by getting them out into the countryside. So you also do OTS urban style, backyard ecology, anything like that?
I have not done OTS urban style. I've always been, I think, more attracted to getting out, and particularly in St. Louis, what I really wanted to do was show students the natural biomes, basically, in the U.S. And so I actually targeted the sites to try to go to the sites that were the least disturbed, or that really had some sort of ecological significance as well. For example, the Indiana Dunes site, which shows this great, in one day you can walk that ecological succession from the beach to the climax beech maple forest, and transverse thousands of years basically of vegetation succession. So we try to sort of hit the highlights and show them the kinds of diversity of biomes that we had in the U.S. So I really have focused on sort of more natural areas.
You've worked all over the tropics, not just in all the sites in Costa Rica, but Ecuador and elsewhere. What's your favorite site? What's a site that you don't need to go back to?
That's a tough question. I will always have an incredibly soft spot in my heart for La Selva, and will always feel at home at La Selva, despite how many changes and how La Selva has grown over the years. But I'll tell you, there's no better place to kind of, view animals in the tropics than La Selva in many ways. And Michael Fogden, who's a very famous photographer, and I have talked about this several different times. I mean, you're so close to everything there at La Selva. And one of my most favorite things, whenever I go back to La Selva, if I can not stuck in a OTS board meeting or Assembly of Delegates meeting, would be to, the first morning I'm there, is have a quick breakfast, get out the binoculars, and then walk across the bridge and start to head myself into the forest. But it would take me about usually an hour and a half to go from the dining hall to the forest edge. And in that hour and a half, I could frequently have about 80 to 100 species of birds. Not all seen, but I mean, that's just how exciting, the biodiversity, and particularly the bird biodiversity, is at La Selva to me. And so it's, an experience that I have done over and over again over the years. And then you get into the forest. And as soon as you walk into the forest and you're only 100 meters in or 200 meters into the forest, then it's like you're away from everything. You won't see many other researchers out there because they do tend to focus their activities more towards the front of the station. So you can still get that feeling of just really being in the forest alone with the ecology and with the animals and stuff. And so it's a really special feeling that, so La Selva will always be in my heart, because that's where I really sort of did cut my tropical teeth, so to speak, working at La Selva and up into Braulio Carrillo National Park. And I guess another sort of favored site would be up about 1,000 meters in Braulio Carrillo, where you would take about half a day or so, depending on where you went in. It might take you a half a day to get in there. But again, you're about 9-10 kilometers from anything else when you're in there. And so it's a really special place with lots of activity. I mean, we would always see jaguar tracks, in the area where we were. We'd always see, really special contingent birds and manakins and all that great stuff up there.
I can't help but notice that you have a lovely necklace on, and maybe we can have a shot of that as well, but say a little bit about your own research.
All right. Well, first, Nat, I've got to say that, the necklace always reminds me of you, because the necklace, which I bought in Costa Rica probably in about 1985 or so, is essentially like, it's a acatea, which is in the Lauraceae, which of course is what you studied and made so famous, working with the phenology of the plants as well as with quetzals, and looking at movements of quetzals in relationship to fruit production and phenology of the Lauraceous fruits. And so actually it's an incredible honor to be interviewed by you, because you were one of my heroes as a young tropical scientist at Monteverde. And so, like you, I was interested in these mutualisms between birds and fruiting plants. And my dissertation work was looking at how fruit-eating birds would follow and track the resources of fruits in different habitats as well as among different forest elevations. So I worked along the gradient from La Selva up into Braulio Carrillo National Park at a variety of different sites up in elevation, and would follow the changes in fruit resources as well as the changes, seasonal changes in the populations of birds, and in particular the populations of fruit-eating birds. And I think that early work in sort of seed dispersal has really defined my whole career. And so I've continued to work in seed dispersal, bird interactions. Some of my students work with bats, some of them work with primates, but with the removal of seeds from fruiting plants, and looking at how birds or other animals are really serving incredibly important ecological functions in tropical forest with respect to sort of plant recruitment and plant regeneration. And one of the major questions I think that drives that fruit frugivore work is trying to understand the importance of biodiversity. And so I've worked in systems like Costa Rica, which is a really incredibly diverse system, but have now moved to Western Amazon, which is even more diverse, and has, instead of 2 or 3 species of manakins, might have 6 to 8 overlapping species of manakins. And manakins, of course, as you know, are important understory fruit-eating birds that disperse seeds. And to understand how the individual roles, I guess, of these different species, and what would be the consequences of local extinction of one of these mutualists from these forest systems, how that might impact the recruitment of plants in a system, and how it might, drive different patterns of abundance of plants as well as distribution of plants. So that has been a really major focus of my research over the years, and it led me to also get very interested in the population dynamics and breeding systems of manakins, which are lek-breeding birds. And lek-breeding birds, a tropical, Adrian Forsyth described as, like being in a tropical singles bar, where all the males gather together and spend most of the day on display courts singing and dancing for females, and then they'll just leave, very briefly to go off and forage on fruit, be gone just a couple of minutes, and come back and pump it up again for the girls, and then the girls come in and check out the boys and make their selection. So I've gotten very interested in sort of how frugivory can drive sexual selection in manakins, and understand that system as well.
Well, you had an amazing impact on the field of frugivory and plant-animal interactions and avian ecology, and in your teaching. You've taught scores of students, and congratulate you on an amazing career that's starting a new phase at Florida, and
Thank you
it's been
very
a pleasure
much.
talking with you.
Thanks, Nat.